So I was working on a new video series for Oak Hill Cemetery, and I was researching one of the stories that I wanted to include in the next installment. And in doing the study and research in the background of the whole story, I decided that this one warranted its own special, unique video because it's a great story about humanity and the special people of Battle Creek at the turn of the century. And I just wanted to share it with you. So here is the story of Ambrose Minty and his cigar factory.
The life of Ambrose Minty began in Bath, England on April 18th, 1842. His parents were Ambrose Minty and Mary Neal, who for some years had lived at Balebrook Gardens, a place located near the town of Bath, where his father conducted hothouses and greenhouses, furnishing the area with fresh vegetables and flowers. In his early education, young Ambrose Minty attended schools in his native country. When he was 10 years old, he came to the United States with his uncle, Maurice Neal, who had been in England on a visit. His uncle lived in Battle Creek, Michigan, and so Ambrose first came to that city as a boy. He stayed there a year and a half studying at the Union School before returning to England. When he returned, he attended a school in Woodward, a suburb of London. It was not long after that he returned to Battle Creek to live with his aunt and uncle and continued at the Union School. When he was 16 years old, he put his textbooks aside and began working on a farm, and later worked for a firm called Buck and Hoyt, with whom he remained until 1871. In that year, at the age of 29, he established a cigar business, entering into a partnership with J.F. Jones, and the firm became known as Jones and Minty, a relationship that remained together for 4 years. The business was adjacent to the Hamblin Opera House at that time. They started on a small scale, and their business slowly grew until 1875, when Ambrose bought out his partner's interest and continued on the business alone. A short time later, he purchased a building and moved his cigar store to East Main Street. The building he acquired was originally built by Mark McCambly in 1836. Mark was the son of the village founder, Sans McCambly. It was unique that it was built on a bridge over the mill race. It had an upstairs that was divided into 2 suites and a main floor that was divided into 3 storefronts. He moved his cigar store into the eastern storefront, and the other 2 on the main floor were rented by 2 barbers. In one of the upstairs suites, he established his cigar factory, and the other suite was leased out to a cobbler. If you look at the 1892 Sanborn fire map, you can see the location of the building here. In present day, it would be where the W.K. Kellogg Foundation building stands. If you follow the mill race in this direction, you would be looking at the fountain at Mill Race Park in downtown. From the beginning, he was engaged in the manufacture as well as of the sale of small-scale cigars. He gradually increased his capacity until his trade had assumed extensive proportions. He would remain operating in this building almost 25 years. As the building was built over the mill race, the foundation of the building had slowly weakened over the years, and the wooden supports underneath the structure had begun to deteriorate. Ambrose was aware that signs of shifting in the foundation had begun in early 1899. His tenants had reported cracks in the plaster and even groans from the timbers below. He had hired some masons and carpenters to begin the task of adding new supports and strengthening the foundation below the structure. They had begun their work in late May, but had taken the holiday of May 30th off. No one had expected, much less realized the full extent of the weakened foundation of the structure. Then a disastrous event happened on Memorial Day, May 30th, 1899. At that time, the holiday was known as Decoration Day. Despite it being a holiday weekend, the barbers and Mr. Minty were open for business. Only the agility of the occupants of the building saved them from what might have been injury. As described in an article written in the Battle Creek Daily Journal, the structure was occupied by A.M. Minty, the tobaccoist, above a cigar factory. Thomas Thorpe used the middle store as a barber, and John J. Evans the extreme west side. Mr. Livingston, the cobbler, had the apartments on the second floor above Evans. The center of the main floor and the entire center structure of the building collapsed into the water. When the crash came down, it was shortly after noon. Minty's store and the barber shops were open, and a mail carrier was in one of the barber's chairs getting a haircut, and the other barber was giving another customer a shave. The one cutting the hair, Jenkins, walked over to Minty's shop to borrow a file to sharpen his scissors, and just as he returned with the tool, he heard from the corner of the room the sound of huge snapping timbers from below. Jenkins gave a shout of warning, and the customers, half-shaven and shorn of locks, scrambled out of the shell of the building as it collapsed around them. With more creaking and crunching, the landmark building collapsed in the center and dropped into the water. There were people in Minty's store as well. They, along with Mr. Minty, had escaped in the nick of time, and upon exiting, turned around just in time to see the building fall. It is here that the story becomes one not of tragedy, but instead emerges as an uplifting lesson in the goodness of humanity. The police and fire department were telephoned and arrived as soon as possible. Despite there being no one to rescue, the firemen from the Hook and Ladder Company unloaded their ladders and placed them up the side of the building on both sides. They climbed into the upstairs windows and began to pass the wooden cases of goods through to be lowered to the streets below. A man who owned a vacant storefront from down the street came forward and offered the space to Minty and the barbers as a temporary place to reestablish. Remember, this was a holiday. The crowd that had gathered began assisting in the removing of all the goods from the cigar shop. Cases of tobacco, boxes of cigars, tobacco leaf, etc. were taken from the cigar factory above. When the business part of the store was relieved of all its contents, the crowd assisted with bringing all of the contents down to the new store down the street. The newspaper later described that the men of the fire department and the volunteers on the street labored with might and main to get all of the goods out of the doomed structure, and after several hours of hard work had accomplished the job. The barber shops took longer to save as the electric linemen had to be called in to first cut all of the wires in the shop. Apparently, when the collapse happened in their shops, wires had broken loose and were hanging down freely. The electricians had to enter the shop and close off the live wires before they could go in and remove the barber chairs and equipment. All of their furniture was eventually removed as well and carried down the street. The volunteers even safely removed the mirrors and some of the large pane windows in the back of the building. In all, the barber's equipment and furniture was successfully removed with little loss experienced. The cobbler's goods were eventually removed as well. Just that story alone shows how amazing the people of Battle Creek were during that time. Citizens dropped what they were doing to help some business owners who were having the worst day of their life and help them save their business. After the collapse, workmen were employed in tearing down the structure, clearing away the debris all night long. And at 7:30 a.m. the next morning, the entire mass of broken walls and dilapidated sections of the building fell again with a crash and a cloud of dust. It was believed the day before that the structure had fallen as far as it was going to go, but apparently a heavily loaded truck had come over the bridge, shaking it, and caused the second collapse. Investigation revealed that the center pylons under the structure had deteriorated from decades of wear from the water of the mill race, and when they gave way, the building folded up like a pocket knife. The fact that the collapse happened on a holiday was fortunate, as typically during a normal weekday there would have been many people in those businesses. and it could have resulted in a loss of life. Ambrose Minty ultimately moved down Main Street and set up shop. He eventually built a new 3-story brick building on the old site, which included sales rooms for his cigars, a factory, and it also included additional rental spaces for other merchants. It was named the Minty Block and sat between Madison and Monroe Street at that time, seen here in the 1902 Sanborn fire map. It was built with steel girders and brick. In 1902, having built up more of the cigar trade, he reorganized and incorporated as the Minty Cigar Company Limited. The company grew to where he was employing 30 people, and he became interested in other business enterprises. He would become president of Merchants Savings Bank, and he was one of the original stockholders for many years. Old Merchants Savings Bank would later merge with Old National Bank and become the Old Merchants National Bank and Trust Company. Years later, it became Security National Bank. In 1876, Ambrose Minty married Miss Isabel Murgatroyd of Battle Creek. They would go on to have one son, Harry, and they lived on Cherry Street. Mr. Minty was regarded in his time as a man with persistent purpose and one who led an exemplary life in all respects. He thoroughly enjoyed life and took great pleasure in all of his friends. He was remembered as always being courteous, kindly, and affable, and those that knew him personally had him for a warm regard. Minty would sell the cigar shop on Main Street to a teller who worked at his bank with him in 1923, Leon Hawk. Mr. Hawk would grow the business and eventually add Hawk's Cafe connected to the cigar store. Hawk later sold the cigar store and opened a clothing business in downtown. In 1926, Ambrose and Isabel would celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary, holding a large reception and open house for friends in the community. In 1927, Minty's Cigar Company Limited, the cigar manufacturing portion of the business, was sold to David Mason in England Company, which eventually went out of business 2 years later when the assets were all liquidated. Although he resigned from the position as president of Old Merchants National Bank that same year, Ambrose would remain on the board of directors of the bank, a position that he would hold until the time of his death. Much property had been acquired by Mr. Minty over the years. Besides the Minty Block, he also owned a large farm on West Territorial Road, where he engaged in several years raising racehorses. He had begun wintering in Los Angeles in 1903 as he had gotten older, and at the age of 89 in 1931, he had been experiencing heart trouble and spent the winter in California. He had felt he was doing well in January and even sent a letter home stating as such to the newspaper. In April, he returned to Battle Creek and, although tired, began resuming his normal activity. He suffered from a heart attack and passed away shortly after. He left an estate in excess of $500,000, which made headlines in the newspaper at the time. This would be the equivalent of $9.7 million today. He left a majority of the estate to his wife and a smaller portion to his son Harry. Isabel would live until 1943, having struggled with poor health for about 8 years by then. She was 91 years old when she passed away. They are both buried at Oak Hill Cemetery. Their son Harry passed away on May 14th, 1959, and he's buried at Dubois Cemetery off of Beckley Road. When I came across the story of Ambrose Minty and his cigar factory, the compelling thing to me was the immediate response of the community. The event of that entire building crashing into the mill race must have been devastating for Mr. Minty and the other business owners. When I was researching this story and I read about how bystanders along with the fire department worked for almost 9 hours straight salvaging goods and equipment from the stores and carried them down the street to a new location, I was moved beyond words. Imagine such an event happening in a present day to a business. Would we see the same outcome? Be honest with yourself. Or would we see a crowd gather and pull out their iPhones and just film the disaster, perhaps even post a TikTok video, and not lift a single finger to assist? Or worse, would we see looting? I make this point because this story exemplifies the importance of studying local history. From discovering these stories, we can perhaps learn important lessons about humanity from those that came before us. Not all history should be repeated. We can certainly draw up a list of terrible things that we can all agree on for sure. However, there are parts of history that are worth remembering. These parts where people were good and came to the aid of others without expectation of anything for themselves. These are some of the best examples, like this story of the Minty building falling into the mill race. Ambrose Minty went on to become a successful man within the community. He was so well thought of that when he had taken ill and went to California to recover, so many people wrote him letters of concern that he was compelled to write a letter to be published in the local paper, telling them all that he was feeling better and they should not worry. One can only imagine how he treated others in the community following that disastrous day in 1899, as he returned his own kindness for that day when so much was offered towards him. It's really worth a consideration. This story and others like it is why I am so passionate about the importance of history. It's why I work on this YouTube channel, and it's why I devote so much time on my podcast. It is also why I became involved with the Battle Creek Regional History Museum. I want to help preserve these wonderful stories, which become lessons of the past for generations to come. Recently, the museum has launched a program called the History Education Center Project. You may have heard about this. I'd like to ask you to check out this link and find out about this important project. patronicity.com/history. This is a campaign that runs through October 15th, 2022. Take a minute today to visit this link. I'll put this link in the description of this YouTube video, and I will put it also in any post that I share this video on social media. Read about the project. Make a donation if you can. The museum has been approved for a matching grant, and in order to receive those funds, they need to crowdfund and match that same amount of funding. This project is the first phase of preserving local history for the Battle Creek Regional History Museum, and the History Education Center plays a big role in that future. It offers a venue in which stories like this can be told and presented to audiences and leave them with a touch of humanity. So I hope that you will take some time today and check out that link, read about the project, and share it with others as well.
I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you liked it, please hit the like button down there, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to check out that project at patronicity.com/history. And I'll see you next time.